What if I told you that a humble Italian monk, bleeding from wounds that appeared from nowhere, saw the exact moment our world would begin to end? What if his vision, dismissed by skeptics for over 70 years, is unfolding right before our eyes with terrifying precision? This isn't folklore or religious fanaticism. This is the documented prophecy of Saint Padre Pio, a man whose supernatural abilities were so disturbing that even the Vatican tried to silence him. His bleeding hands bore the wounds of Christ, but his mind carried something far more unsettling, a crystal-clear vision of humanity's approaching judgment. The year was 1947 when Padre Pio received what he would later describe as the most terrifying revelation of his life. As blood seeped from the stigmata that had marked his flesh for nearly 3 decades, he witnessed events so catastrophic, so precisely detailed, that those who heard his prophecy begged him never to speak of it again. But the saint couldn't remain silent. He knew that somewhere in the distant future, people would need to understand what was coming. He knew they would need to recognize the signs before it was too late. Today, as natural disasters accelerate beyond scientific prediction, as social fabric tears in ways that defy explanation, as unexplainable phenomena ripple across the globe, those who remember Padre Pio's words are beginning to feel a bone-deep terror. The prophecy isn't coming, it's here. The events he described with supernatural clarity are manifesting with clockwork precision, and the world remains oblivious to the cosmic forces now in motion. But perhaps most chilling of all is what Padre Pio said would happen when the final phase begins. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 20, 1918, something impossible happened in a small monastery chapel in San Giovanni Rotondo, Italy. Francesco Forgione, a simple Capuchin friar known as Padre Pio, was praying alone when searing pain exploded through his hands and feet. Blood began flowing from wounds that appeared instantaneously, perfect replicas of Christ's crucifixion injuries. But this wasn't the beginning of Padre Pio's supernatural torment. It was merely the most visible manifestation of abilities that would both terrify and mystify the world for the next 50 years. The stigmata defied every medical examination. Doctors probed, tested, and analyzed the wounds, finding tissue that regenerated impossibly fast yet never fully healed. The blood flow followed no known physiological pattern, sometimes stopping completely during times of spiritual ecstasy, other times gushing with such intensity that Padre Pio would collapse from blood loss. What disturbed physicians most wasn't the wounds themselves, it was the fact that they carried a perfume-like fragrance that permeated everything Padre Pio touched, a scent so distinctive that people could detect his presence in a room he had left hours earlier. But the stigmata was only the beginning of Padre Pio's otherworldly manifestations. Witnesses documented his ability to appear in multiple locations simultaneously, a phenomenon called bilocation that the Vatican investigated extensively but could never debunk. Sick pilgrims who had never met him described detailed conversations with Padre Pio that occurred while he was hundreds of miles away, verifiably present in his monastery. These encounters weren't dreams or hallucinations. They resulted in miraculous healings that medical science couldn't explain, documented by doctors who had abandoned their skepticism in the face of overwhelming evidence. Perhaps most unsettling was Padre Pio's ability to read souls with terrifying accuracy. Penitents who approached him for confession found themselves exposed completely, their deepest secrets revealed before they could speak. He would recount private conversations, hidden sins, and intimate details of their lives with surgical precision. Many fled in terror, unable to comprehend how this bleeding monk could peer directly into their consciousness. Others returned again and again, desperate for the spiritual healing that only someone with such supernatural insight could provide. The Vatican's response revealed the true extent of Padre Pio's disturbing abilities. Rather than celebrating these miraculous manifestations, church officials grew increasingly alarmed. Secret investigations were launched, restrictions were imposed, and for nearly a decade, Padre Pio was forbidden from celebrating public mass or hearing confessions. The Church's fear wasn't rooted in doubt about his holiness, it stemmed from terror about the implications of his powers. If Padre Pio could transcend the laws of physics, if he could access divine knowledge directly, what else might he see? In 1947, that question would be answered in the most chilling way possible. As Padre Pio knelt in prayer during the Feast of the Assumption, his consciousness was suddenly transported far beyond the confines of his monastery cell. He found himself witnessing events that wouldn't occur for decades, seeing humanity's future with the same crystal clarity that allowed him to read human souls. What he saw in that vision would haunt him for the remaining 21 years of his life, and more importantly, it would provide a roadmap for recognizing the end times that is now unfolding with terrifying precision. The prophecy that emerged from that supernatural revelation wasn't delivered as a dramatic pronouncement. Instead, it came in fragments, whispered confessions to trusted confidants, coded warnings embedded in his letters, cryptic references during his homilies. Padre Pio understood that the full truth would be too overwhelming for most people to accept. But he also knew that when the time came, those fragments would form a complete picture that could no longer be ignored. That time is now. The vision began like a film reel unwinding in Padre Pio's mind, each frame revealing humanity's future with excruciating detail. As he knelt in his cell on that August evening in 1947, the walls of time dissolved around him, and he found himself witnessing events that would unfold 7 decades later. What he saw wasn't metaphorical or symbolic, it was literal, specific, and absolutely terrifying. The first images showed natural disasters occurring in rapid succession, but not randomly. They followed a pattern, a divine choreography that would accelerate until the earth itself seemed to convulse in preparation for something far worse. Padre Pio described massive earthquakes striking in clusters, each one triggering the next in a domino effect that would span continents. He saw volcanoes awakening simultaneously after centuries of dormancy, their eruptions creating atmospheric chaos that would disrupt weather patterns globally. But most disturbing were his visions of the oceans themselves rebelling against humanity. He witnessed unprecedented tsunamis, rising sea levels that would swallow coastal cities, and marine ecosystems collapsing in ways that would starve millions. These weren't isolated catastrophes, they were coordinated events, as if the planet itself was executing a predetermined plan. The supernatural clarity of Padre Pio's vision extended beyond natural disasters to human behavior. He saw social structures disintegrating with shocking speed, but not through war or economic collapse. Instead, he witnessed a spiritual crisis that would manifest as mass hysteria, inexplicable violence, and a collective abandonment of moral principles that had governed civilization for millennia. People would turn against their neighbors without reason, families would fragment over trivial disagreements, and entire communities would descend into chaos driven by forces they couldn't understand or control. Most chilling was Padre Pio's description of what he called the Great Deception. He saw false prophets and miracle workers emerging across the globe, performing supernatural feats that would convince millions they were witnessing divine intervention. But these manifestations weren't from God. They were demonic counterfeits designed to lead humanity away from salvation at the moment when spiritual discernment was most crucial. The technology that would amplify these deceptions hadn't been invented in 1947, but Padre Pio described it with startling accuracy. Devices that could transmit images and sounds instantly across the world, creating a global audience for supernatural phenomena that would appear authentic to all but the most spiritually discerning. When Padre Pio first shared fragments of his vision with his spiritual director, Father Benedetto, the elderly priest's reaction was immediate and visceral. He begged Padre Pio never to speak of these things again, fearing that such knowledge would drive people to despair. But Padre Pio insisted that the vision came with a purpose. Hidden within the catastrophic events was a timeline, a series of signs that would allow the faithful to recognize when the final phase was beginning. More importantly, the vision included specific instructions for spiritual preparation that could protect souls even as the physical world collapsed around them. The most disturbing aspect of Padre Pio's prophecy wasn't the scale of destruction he foresaw, it was the timing. He repeatedly emphasized that these events would begin in earnest during the early decades of the 21st century, accelerating rapidly until reaching a crescendo that would determine humanity's eternal fate. He described specific astronomical alignments, technological developments, and cultural shifts that would serve as unmistakable markers. Those who understood the signs would have perhaps a decade to prepare spiritually before the final test began. Father Benedetto documented Padre Pio's growing agitation as the years passed and the preliminary signs he had foreseen began manifesting exactly as predicted. The saint would spend hours in prayer, tears streaming down his face as he contemplated the suffering that awaited humanity. Yet he never wavered in his insistence that the prophecy served a merciful purpose. God was providing advance warnings so that souls could be saved even as the world ended. The question that tormented Padre Pio wasn't whether his vision would come to pass. It was whether anyone would recognize the signs in time to heed the warning. By the time of his death in 1968, Padre Pio had shared complete details of his prophecy with only 3 people: Father Benedetto, his successor Father Pellegrino, and a mysterious Vatican official whose identity was never revealed. Each of them was sworn to secrecy until the signs became unmistakable. That oath of silence lasted over 50 years, but as the events Padre Pio predicted began accelerating in the early 2020s, the surviving witnesses knew their silence was no longer justified. The prophecy wasn't coming, it had arrived. Father Pellegrino's hands trembled as he held the sealed envelope that had remained locked in the monastery's archives for over 30 years. The year was 1999, and he had just witnessed the first of Padre Pio's predicted signs, a series of seemingly unrelated natural disasters that followed the exact sequence the saint had described. Inside the envelope was Padre Pio's complete written account of his 1947 vision, along with explicit instructions about when and how the prophecy should be revealed. The moment Father Pellegrino had dreaded for decades had finally arrived, but the world was about to enter a new millennium filled with optimism and technological promise. Who would believe that humanity's darkest hour was just beginning? The challenge of sharing Padre Pio's prophecy wasn't skepticism about the supernatural. It was the sheer overwhelm of information. The saint's vision had been so detailed, so comprehensive, that even committed believers struggled to process its implications. Padre Pio had foreseen specific dates, geographical locations, and even the names of technologies that wouldn't be invented for decades. He had described social media platforms, artificial intelligence, and genetic engineering with startling accuracy, explaining how these innovations would be used to amplify the spiritual deception that would precede humanity's final test. But in 1999, these technologies seemed like science fiction rather than prophetic truth. Father Pellegrino began sharing fragments of the prophecy with select church officials, carefully choosing those who had demonstrated both spiritual maturity and intellectual flexibility. The responses were uniformly disturbing. Even high-ranking Vatican officials who had spent their lives studying mystical phenomena found Padre Pio's predictions too specific, too detailed, and too terrifying to accept. Several bishops who read the complete text suffered what could only be described as spiritual breakdowns, abandoning their positions to retreat into contemplative monasteries where they could pray for humanity's salvation without confronting the reality of what was coming. The few attempts to share Padre Pio's prophecy publicly met with predictable resistance. In 2001, an Italian television documentary briefly mentioned the saint's warnings about accelerating natural disasters, but the segment was edited so heavily that the original meaning was lost. Newspaper articles that attempted to explore the prophecy were either buried on back pages or dismissed as religious sensationalism. The world was focused on technological progress, economic growth, and global connectivity. The idea that a bleeding monk from rural Italy had accurately predicted humanity's approaching judgment seemed absurdly anachronistic. Meanwhile, the signs Padre Pio had described continued manifesting with clockwork precision. The increasing frequency of natural disasters, the emergence of technologies that could manipulate human perception, the gradual erosion of moral foundations that had sustained civilization for millennia. All of it was unfolding exactly as the saint had foreseen. Father Pellegrino watched with growing horror as each predicted milestone was reached, knowing that the timeline was accelerating toward events so catastrophic that most people would be unable to comprehend them until it was too late. The most disturbing aspect of the world's rejection of Padre Pio's prophecy wasn't intellectual skepticism, it was spiritual blindness. Even devout Catholics who venerated the saint and accepted his miraculous abilities refused to engage seriously with his prophetic warnings. They preferred to focus on his healings, his stigmata, and his pastoral wisdom while ignoring the most important message he had ever received. This selective acceptance confirmed another aspect of Padre Pio's vision. He had foreseen that spiritual deception would begin within the Church itself, as believers chose comfort over truth. By 2010, Father Pellegrino was one of only 2 people alive who had heard the complete prophecy directly from Padre Pio. The weight of that knowledge had aged him prematurely, and he spent increasingly long hours in prayer, begging for guidance about his responsibility to warn humanity. The signs were accelerating, the timeline was approaching critical junctures, and the world remained utterly unprepared for what was coming. In his final years, Father Pellegrino made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable earlier in his life. He began secretly documenting everything, creating a complete record that could survive even if the church hierarchy continued to suppress the truth. The irony wasn't lost on Father Pellegrino that Padre Pio had predicted even this suppression. The saint had foreseen that his prophecy would be ignored, dismissed, and actively hidden until the very moment when its warnings could no longer be denied. But he had also promised that when that moment arrived, the truth would emerge through unexpected channels, reaching exactly the people who needed to hear it. As Father Pellegrino sealed his final testament in 2015, he prayed that Padre Pio's promise would prove accurate. Humanity's window for spiritual preparation was rapidly closing, and soon even the most skeptical observers would be forced to confront the reality that a simple Italian monk had seen their future with supernatural clarity. Dr. Elena Marchetti had spent 20 years dismissing religious prophecies as psychological artifacts of primitive thinking, but the data streaming across her computer screen in early 2020 challenged every scientific assumption she had ever held. As head of the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, she had access to the most sophisticated atmospheric monitoring systems on Earth, and what they were detecting defied explanation. Weather patterns weren't just becoming more extreme, they were following sequences that seemed almost choreographed, as if some intelligence was orchestrating global climate chaos according to a predetermined script that human science couldn't decode. The anomalies had begun subtly in 2018, with storm systems that formed in impossible ways and followed trajectories that violated established meteorological principles. Hurricane paths that should have curved harmlessly into the Atlantic instead maintained laser-straight courses toward populated coastlines. Drought patterns emerged simultaneously across continents that had no climatological connection, creating agricultural failures that rippled through global food networks with mathematical precision. Most disturbing were the temperature fluctuations that occurred without any identifiable cause, massive heat domes that appeared overnight and vanished just as suddenly, leaving scientists scrambling for explanations that their instruments couldn't provide. Some religious leaders embraced the phenomena as divine interventions, while others condemned them as demonic deceptions, creating spiritual chaos that left millions of believers without reliable guidance during humanity's most crucial decision point.